Hello, Helen. Great to see you today. How are you doing?
Oh, doing fine, Russell. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thanks for agreeing to talk. In these sort of interviews I've been doing for the ELS on YouTube, I've usually started by asking people how they got into canon law in the first place. Do you want to share a bit of your sort of background?
Yeah, well, I never expected ever to be a canon lawyer. I started out, my first degree was history and politics, and then I trained as a chartered accountant because I thought I would make loads and loads of money. But then I joined a religious congregation, which kind of interesting. God has a sense of humour, right enough. And then I studied philosophy of religion and Christian ethics, and I studied that at Heathrow, and I taught Christian ethics for many years. During that time, there was a colleague started up an MA in Canon Law, and I started to get quite interested in it because, well, it was interesting because in 1983, when the code was first promulgated, I was walking through a theological library, and it was displayed in pride of place. And I remember vividly shaking my fist at it and saying, the church doesn't need this nonsense canon law. But then there was an incident where an uncle of mine was refused a requiem mass when he died. He was any typical West of Scotland man, you know, four-wheel Catholic. And the priest said, it's the law of the church. Now, this caused huge shockwaves through our family, and people were very hurt and so on. And I thought, I wonder really if it is the law of the church or his interpretation. And that's what kind of got me started on the issue of justice and how we interpret canon law. Anyway, long story short, I ended up studying the MA in canon law at Heathrow, and then investigated taking it further and did distance learning at Leuven in Belgium, did license and the PhD. So it's still quite surprising to me that I actually got into it, but in fact it's a much more interesting subject than the Christian ethics, to be honest.
Right. And what was the topic of your PhD?
It was, my PhD in Christian ethics was looking at the issue of conscience and marriage breakdown.
Right.
My license in canon law was on the sex abuse crisis and my concern about how priests were being treated. And then for my doctorate in canon law, I did temporal goods, stewardship, and the challenge of churches demonstrating public benefit.
Right.
From sex to money.
Yeah. Well, it's covering huge topics there. And have you kept in those areas with your sort of research interests since?
Yeah, I've just had an article accepted for the Ecclesiastical Law Journal on critique of Pope Francis's Vos Estis Lux Mundi, where he sets down principles where allegations are made and who should deal with them. I do a lot of consultation work. People seem to find my name and get in touch with me. It might be people looking at issues of marriage annulment. It could be abuse cases, or it could be where religious are having problems with their superiors, or superiors are having problems with difficult religious. So there's and also temporal goods as well. Since I'm an accountant, I did work for our province for a number of years as the province bursar. I've finally been liberated from that. So, I mean, I spent 26 years. That was when I was teaching as well. And I mean, I like money. I know how to spend it as well. So temporal goods has always been at the forefront as well.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. And so as you know, the ELS, our sort of main focus, primary focus, is ecclesiastical law, the Church of England, other Anglican churches, but we absolutely do branch out, interested in ecclesiastical law in other communions, as indeed your article for the journal makes clear, doesn't it? But I thought it might be interesting just to talk for a minute or two about the canon law scene in the Catholic Church, if you like. I mean, I guess as with the Church of England, church law touches pretty much every area of life. But in terms of the practice of canon law, the things that we most hear about, I suppose, in ordinary day-to-day are the marriage tribunals that you've already mentioned. I mean, is that the most active area for day-to-day?
That tends to be, yes. And I think in terms of safeguarding as well, that has become an enormous area, with people working out how to interpret the canons and so on. So that is itself, and also rights of defence of priests and religious who've been accused, and seeking justice as well. So those are the main things. But people tend to, when they hear about canon law, they think of marriage and marriage breakdown. And it always comes as a surprise to people when I've been giving talks in parishes and things on rights and obligations in the church. We have rights? Ooh, well, yeah. Parish priests tend to get very nervous. But it's important, rights and responsibilities. And so they are really interested in that kind of thing. But generally people don't really understand canon law, which is a shame, because I think it's a most fascinating subject.
Absolutely. So what you say about giving a talk in a parish, is that to the ordinary parishioners? People turn up because they're just interested in finding a bit more about the law of the church?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, usually, sometimes it might be on marriage breakdown, that kind of thing. But, rights and responsibilities in the church, rights, they're really fascinated to know that. That really sparks a lot of debate and discussion.
And would that normally be the average parishioner's sort of first exposure to canon law, would you think?
Yeah, it tends to be. Most people don't really know that canon law exists.
Sure. So the formal teaching of canon law, that would obviously, people like yourself who go into it from the academic side, but would normally, I guess, in the training of seminarians, are they taught a bit of canon law at that?
Oh yeah, yes. I teach them an introduction to canon law, sacramental law, and marriage. And in between, I shove in things like penal law. Why does the church excommunicate people, for example? I think about it as the ecclesiastical naughty step.
Right.
That step, and think about what you've done, and then come back, as it were. It's not meant to exclude someone forever, but get them to reflect on what their actions have done in terms of the community. Right.
No, that's interesting. At that level, would the canon law teaching be in English, in the vernacular? But I guess when you're getting to the doctoral level, I guess you have to engage with the Latin text.
The Latin is the official language of the code. Yeah. You do need to know a fair bit, because also the translations into English can vary as well, and that puts a different spin on things as well. So knowing how to interpret the code. I often say that a friend of mine once said to me, the Code of Canon Law is a handy wee book. I said, well, that's true. I says, but in the wrong hands, it can be a weapon of mass destruction. Because if people just pick up the book and open it, and they think they know what they're reading, but you have to be able to interpret it. And also, it is updated. It's not static. It's updated to fill in various gaps. For example, no one thought when the 83 code was published that any woman would attempt to be ordained as a priest. So there was no sanction on that. There is now. Some of the stuff on sex abuse, there was nothing about downloading child pornography as a canonical crime. That was remedied by an addition. So it's been updated, it's ongoing, and so you need to know also the updates as well. Yeah, because the actual code isn't as such, the printed code isn't updated, is it? It's No, it isn't, no. You need to know the changes that have been made, yeah. And I'm interested in the educational side of teaching canon law, because obviously the Ecclesiastical Law Society, that's one of the central interests of the society, through journals, conferences, lectures and seminars, but also just facilitating and encouraging ecclesiastical law in the parishes. So people like
church wardens, for example, especially when it comes to a vacancy, but all the time, it really helps for people to know the basics of the law. Now, I think I'm right in saying that you abolished church wardens at the Council of Trent, but there must be equivalent lay people, are there, who need to know a little bit of the functioning of parishes, or does it mainly fall to the clergy too?
It mainly falls to the clergy. I think in terms of temporal goods, looking after the finances of the church, there has to be an understanding about stewardship, securing assets, honouring the wishes of donors. That's in the Book 5 of the Code. So they might need to have some kind of spin on it,
Yeah.
I did give a talk once I was invited by a diocesan finance team to come and just give them the basics of canon law. That was good that they asked, because it clarified things for them in terms of the potential clashes between canon and civil law,
Yeah.
So I think that was quite useful. And I think that, every finance committee in a parish, for example, should at least have some of the basic understanding of what the canon law says about the stewardship of temporal goods.
Yeah, absolutely. How interesting. Yeah, I mean, that all very much chimes with a lot of those similar issues about the basic knowledge of the law in the parishes in our church as well. And I suppose it seems to me that where the Catholic Church always has a really well-established academic discipline, which in the Church of England kind of faded away for a while, and just in the past few decades has been springing into life again, of great benefit to the church as the amount of study and research in its law is advanced. But people do reasonably frequently do doctorates in canon law in the Catholic Church, as yourself, don't they? I mean, it's seen as something people do. It was not so unheard of or so unusual as a thing as perhaps it would be in comparison in the Church of England.
Yeah, and of course there are well-established faculties of canon law throughout the world. Europe, America, Canada, and so on. So yeah, it's that the of course, because one of the issues, of course, is numbers. You're always competing for a dwindling pool, as it were. Because canon law, unless you've got a teaching position, working as a canon lawyer in the UK doesn't pay. Whereas the situation is different in the States. So there's an issue about lay people becoming canon lawyers because it is difficult to be paid properly.
Yeah, sure. I guess in the Church of England, the lawyers who move into ecclesiastical law, it's just one area of their practice. They're lawyers with other areas of practice as well. I think pretty much for the most part. And do people come to you for sort of academic supervision and that sort of thing?
Yes, I've supervised quite a number of license dissertations from Liv, and certainly from the MA in Heathrop when it was still going. Not many doctorates though, but certainly license dissertations.
And is the other side of the education in canon law, I guess, is the things like the lectures and seminars and conferences. Is there much of that in the canon law world in the UK?
Yeah, there's an annual conference, and well, depends. I belong to various societies: Canon Law Society of America, New Zealand, and Australia. One day I must get to those conferences, and then there might be day talks or stuff like that. So I encourage students to have a look at it, and I notice there's quite a lot of stuff now appearing on the web, which is interesting. I did wonder whether I should set up my own canon law website, but then I thought, that's quite a lot of work, So.
Yeah. Well, no, that's really, really fascinating, Helen. It's so interesting to get an insight into some of the same questions in the society and in the Church of England about canon law, but from the perspective of your church, obviously, that has that much longer uninterrupted tradition of taking canon law seriously.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for talking today. It's been really interesting, and I hope that we maybe be able to catch up again in the future, perhaps face to face, when all these various meetings and conferences can happen again. That'd be good.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Thanks very much.
Good to talk to you then. Bye.
Bye.